Good evening. I'm Warren Hoge, IPI's Senior Adviser for External Relations, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this distinguished author series event featuring David E. Sanger, author of The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age. This is also the first in this series of author appearances in which we are joined by a new and very welcome co-sponsor, the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Throughout the hall tonight are faculty, friends, and most important, students of Seton Hall, and we at IPI are delighted to be partnering with you. David Sanger is one of the New York Times' most prolific and authoritative writers, often, as many of you know, on top of the news and on top of the front page. Just yesterday, he wrote a characteristically savvy piece of analysis, headlined, "Missing Journalist Case May Disrupt Trump's Plan to Squeeze Iran." He was the member of 3 teams of New York Times reporters that have won the Pulitzer Prize, and over his 36-year Times career, he has served as Tokyo bureau chief, Washington economic correspondent, White House correspondent during the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations, chief Washington correspondent, and now national security correspondent. He has written 2 bestsellers on foreign policy and national security, The Inheritance, The World Obama Confronts and Challenges to American Power, which came out just as Obama was taking office in 2009, and Confront and Conceal, Obama's Secret Wars and Surprising Use of American Power in 2012. That one told the story of the electronic sabotage of Iran's nuclear program by means of a computer worm known as Stuxnet. It was a development that became public, by the way, in 2011 when David first reported on it. It was also, I suspect, and I don't really know if this is true, a scoop that brought David and the Times the attention of lots of government attorneys.
We did. 4-year-long FBI investigation.
Exactly. The Perfect Weapon reads like a spy thriller. And by the way, I should say at this point, there are copies of the book on sale at the door, and I will make sure we get finished in time to give you time to chat with David and let him sign purchase copies. But The Perfect Weapon, it reads like a spy thriller, and among its many attributes, it recounts in revealing detail the Russian attempts to affect the 2016 US election. Now, since the advent of nuclear weapons, American deterrence has been based on the notion that only adversarial nations with nuclear weapons pose an existential threat to the nation's security. The arrival of cyber weapons has changed all of that. It is not an exaggeration to call cyber the perfect weapon, as David Book spells out with chilling conviction. Less than a decade ago, cyber war wasn't even on the National Intelligence Agency's radar. Now it's listed as the #1 threat to American national security, as Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats told Congress last February. Just this month, after the Russian GRU intelligence service was found to be planning cyber attacks on the Organization of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons offices in The Hague, Mark Lyle Grant, once the British ambassador here at the UN and later the country's national security advisor, gave a speech in London saying that cyber attacks were, and I quote, "a major threat to the survival of the liberal world order." That's quite a claim. David's pretty convincing, too, in his view that the Trump administration is ignorant, maybe willfully so, of the size and imminence of the menace. You may have noticed that John Bolton recently eliminated the position of cybersecurity coordinator on the National Security Council staff. Now, I could alarm you with more claims of just how terrifying these weapons are, and how unprepared we are to deal with them. But let me instead turn that responsibility over to the writer who put the word fear in the subtitle of his book. For all the reasons I have just enumerated, and the added fact that he is an old friend and cherished former New York Times colleague, please join me in welcoming to IPI David E. Sanger.
Well, thank you, Warren. Thanks all of you for coming. It's a great honor to be here at the International Peace Institute, but it's a truly great honor to be here at the first one that you have done with all the great students and faculty of Seton Hall. So thank you all for coming. Warren has clearly learned what I've learned in the course that I teach on national security, which is if you want to get students to show up and talk about international relations at 6 p.m., you provide good food.
And drink.
It works, yeah. Warren, I owe you a great thanks. When Warren was a foreign editor at the Times and then assistant managing editor, he actually took the risk of sending a green 27-year-old out to Tokyo to be Tokyo correspondent and later Tokyo bureau chief. And my time in Asia actually made a huge difference to me, both personally and professionally. And going abroad, as I would say to all of these students, is not only a great thing to do after you have graduated, but it makes you view your country entirely differently when you come back, because it has set off your meter when you hear people discussing the way the world works, and you know from your personal experience, it isn't actually how the world works. And it really set me up to go right on issues of national security, nuclear weapons, cyber weapons. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about just what the main themes of The Perfect Weapon are, a little bit of what I found in the course of my reporting. Warren alluded to a little bit of this when he talked about Stuxnet, which you may all remember was the code that leaked out from the Natanz nuclear enrichment plant in 2010 and started a big journalistic rush to figure out what this incredibly sophisticated code was. And I spent about 14 months with some colleagues working through trying to investigate what this was all about. We had our suspicions from the beginning because in that first book that I had written, The Inheritance, it had revealed that at the end of the Bush administration, President Bush, recognizing that having gone to war over some nuclear weapons that did not exist in Iraq, he did not have the ability to go launch another military attack against a country that really was trying to build nuclear weapons, Iran. So a group of generals and intelligence officials showed up in the Oval Office one day in about 2008 and said to him, you know, Mr. President, actually I think it was 2007, you know, Mr. President, we think we may have a way of slowing down the Iranian program without actually having to bomb them. And better yet, if it works, it'll keep the Israelis from bombing them as well, which was the largest American fear at the time, that Israel would go in and conduct a military strike, and the US would, within a week or two, get sucked into yet another war in the Middle East. And as Condi Rice pointed out to the president on several occasions, we have several of those underway, sir. We probably don't need one more. So the way they explained this, you could get some code into the computers that controlled the giant centrifuges that spin at supersonic speeds and make them basically go wobbly, speed them up and slow them down until they so began to go out of whack that they would blow up. And the theory was that if you did it subtly enough, the Iranians would not know whether this was because they had made a mistake in manufacturing, because their engineers were bad, because they had some other kind of internal problem, or because someone was messing with them. And it actually worked for a few years. First, the United States, the president's direction, President Bush's direction, went off and tested this. We had a bunch of centrifuges that looked just like this that we had gotten courtesy of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya when he turned over his nuclear program. Group of generals went down to the nuclear labs in Tennessee, said, we're going to borrow your centrifuges, don't really expect to get them back. They built a model of the Natanz plant in a hillside in Tennessee secretly, and then they started bombarding it with code. And sure enough, these things began to blow up. They took the shards of it, they put them on an airplane, they flew them to Washington, they drove them in the northwest gate of the White House, dumped them out over the Situation Room conference table, and invited the president down to see what the first cyber weapon executed by the United States would actually have done. The president came down, he looked at it, and he said, well, in a polite company like this, I shouldn't say what he said, but it began with O, okay? So, it was a good Texas phrase. At that point, the US began the most sophisticated cyber attack that one state had ever started on another. And President Obama inherited this when he came in 2009. He had never really thought about offensive cyber very much. But as he began to take it on, he got to the point where he was going down in the Situation Room and actually opening up this giant diagram of all of the centrifuges at Natanz and picking out sections that they were going to attack the way Lyndon Johnson used to go pick out bombing targets in Vietnam. Just think about that. Here we had a president so wrapped up in a cyber weapon that months before he didn't even know existed, that he was picking targets. He also had a big concern. His worry was that once it came out that we were using cyber weapons like this, every other country that was interested in attacking us or already trying to attack us would use this as an excuse to go off and do just that. And the perfect weapon picks up the story when we had a post-Stuxnet world. When I had written the previous book with a group of research assistants about the age of our students here, we looked around for Confront and Conceal to try to find another sophisticated state-on-state attack. We couldn't find one. Found some denial of service attacks where you turn things off or overwhelm a country, but nothing of the sophistication of Olympic Games, which was the code name for the Stuxnet operation. When we started working on this book, we stopped counting sophisticated attacks when we hit 200 or 250. And those were just the ones that were public, became public. So it's probably just a fraction of what was going on in the real world. We now have between 35 and 40 countries that are capable of launching sophisticated cyber attacks. 6 years ago, you would have counted that number on one or two hands. So where does that leave us now? It leaves us in a world in which cyber has become the primary way that countries seek to undercut and influence each other with short-of-war operations. And short-of-war is the key element here. No one's dumb enough to take on the United States in a direct military conflict. The Russians clearly don't want to do that. The Chinese don't want to go do that. Certainly not the North Koreans or the Iranians. And this is what makes cyber the perfect weapon. It's hard to detect. It's extremely hard to figure out where it came from. You know, in the nuclear age, you could go into a big cave in Colorado Springs and see where the missiles were launching from. You can't do that in the cyber world. When the Chinese came to attack the New York Times computers after that series of stories we ran about who was getting enriched in the family of the Chinese prime minister, the attack looked like it came from a university in the southern United States because that was the last stop. And as the Seton Hall students know better than anybody, universities are an incredibly attractive target for anybody launching cyber attacks because they've got lots of broadband, thanks to all the Netflix you guys are downloading. And it's largely open, right? Because it's got to be open. And see, for a university, it is basically a cyber attacker's dream. right? So we began to see that the weapon was useful because it's cheap, it's deniable, and it can be precisely targeted. And most importantly, you can dial it up and dial it down. Can't do that with a nuclear weapon. With a nuclear weapon, it's either on or off, right? And that's the reason mutually assured destruction has worked. There's no such thing as launching a small nuclear attack on somebody. But with cyber, you can so target it that you can try to calibrate it to make sure that a country does not come back and bomb you. And basically, that's what's happened to us for the past 6 years. It's what's happened when the North Koreans decided to go after Sony Pictures Entertainment for turning out a truly terrible movie called The Interview. There are some people in the front of this row here who probably haven't seen that. There are probably a lot of people in the back who have seen it. For those who haven't seen it, I can save 2 hours of your life by suggesting that you not bother. But basically, the concept of the movie is that two reporters, one of which is played by James Rogan, go off and interview Kim Jong-un. This was before the president was in love with Kim Jong-un, and or said he was in love with Kim Jong-un. They're tasked by the CIA to go out and assassinate him on the way out by blowing him up. Now, those of you in the room, Warren included, who have been hanging around newsrooms for so many decades know that if you're going to choose a group of people to be hitmen, the last people you would choose would be a group of journalists. They would probably screw it up. But the fact of the matter is, that was the premise of the movie. And so the North Koreans went out first to stop the movie. And they did it in the most normal way you would imagine. They wrote a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations, right over here, knowing just how influential he was in Hollywood. When that didn't work, astoundingly, they sent a team out of North Korea to operate from China, Thailand, Malaysia. They broke into Sony's computer systems, which were incredibly ill-defended. They spent months lurking around trying to understand how those computer systems were linked to the accounting department, to the movie production units, to storing movies that are going to come out, to the email system. They released many emails long before the Russians thought of this. This is how we learned the important news that Angelina Jolie can be difficult to work with on the set. And then on the day after Thanksgiving 2014, they launched their attack. And they melted down 70% of Sony's computing systems. Now think about that.
Yeah.
Was that an act of industrial sabotage? Was it an act of vandalism, a word that President Obama used and later regretted? Was it an act of war? What would have happened if the North Koreans didn't have access to cyber and instead they had landed some commandos at Long Beach and called an Uber and gone up to the Sony studios, probably commenting to each other, they didn't know there were this many cars in the world, and gotten on the studio tour and stuck some dynamite under the computer center and blown it sky high? If we had all woken up and seen on CNN pictures of a burning Sony studio with smoke going up over the Hollywood Hills, whoever was president, Democrat, Republican, Martian, I don't care who it was, they would have had to make something blow up in Pyongyang. But because they used cyber to do it, because the attack was so subtle, because it took weeks to figure out what exactly had happened, the worst thing they got were some sanctions, which they probably never felt amid all the other sanctions we have on North Korea. Around the same time, the Chinese were going into the Office of Personnel Management, the most boring bureaucracy in Washington, which is saying a lot. And they had spent a year pulling out of OPM's databases at night the security files on 22 million Americans who had applied for security clearances. They wanted the elite of the US government who worked on the most secret projects. All of this data had been stored by the Office of Personnel Management in unused computer space at the Interior Department, where it got all the same protections that, say, bison migration in Yellowstone get. It was unencrypted. The Chinese encrypted it and sent it back to Beijing, so that by encrypting it, they were making sure that we couldn't see what they were stealing. Later, when this all came out, OPM sent a group of people out to explain to me why it wasn't terribly important to encrypt this data, why there were other ways to protect it. And a few weeks later, they issued a little item in the Federal Register, a contract to encrypt all of this data, which they should have done decades ago. So I wrote a little story about it when somebody sent this to me. And I said, why don't you just give the contract to the Chinese? They've already done all the work. Turned out that the general counsel at OPM did not think that was as funny as I did. Anyway, interesting question again. Was this a cyber attack? Or was this just espionage? Interestingly, our own intelligence agencies tried to convince Congress this wasn't an attack. It was just another form of espionage. Why did they take that position? Because they didn't want this categorized as an act of war or an attack, because we do it to everybody else as well. The book is full of other examples of this, an effort by the United States, which only worked in part, to go sabotage the North Korean missile launches, a process called left of launch. In other words, to try to mess up a missile before it launches, because you don't have very much confidence in the missile defenses you have after it launches. And a lot of missiles blew up. We don't know how many of them because of the cyber attack, which was sort of interesting because it tells you that this can work, but sometimes just for a while. In fact, in October of 2016, just at the height of the presidential election, the same weeks that you were hearing the Access Hollywood tape and so forth, Kim Jong-un actually killed off the missile program that the US was sabotaging and replaced it with another that he had been working away on, which we have not been very successful at stopping. So it tells you that for all its perfection, there are things that cyber can miss. Why is that interesting? Because once again, the United States came to the conclusion it couldn't afford to go to war in a direct conflict, in this case with North Korea, but it could use this new weapon in an effort to try to go slow or sabotage the program. So I could go on with many examples like this, but it takes you really, Warren, to the last big questions that I ask in this book. One of them is, if we're ever going to get out of this problem, can we do it simply with technology that makes our stuff more impermeable? I don't think so. Just as there were no perfect technological solutions in the atomic age to protect us against nuclear attack, just as there have been no perfect technological solutions against chemical weapons, biological weapons, or bombs dropped by airplanes, or even by terrorist attack, there are no surefire technological solutions in cyber. We have a permanent state of low-level cyber conflict underway, and the prospect of a much larger cyber conflict, because every major country, including us, have changed all of their war planning so that a conflict would start with a cyber attack. You'll read in the book about a program called Nitro Zeus, a secret program that US Cyber Command, which has just been elevated to higher status in the military, created to unplug all of Iran if we ended up going to war with them. The theory being that if you could turn the country off, you don't really need to bomb it. That's where we're headed in a world of new conflict. And that's something that artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all will make even more complex, because they speed up the process and take human judgment out of the loop when you're trying to figure out how do you stop this escalation? Stopping escalation is a central question. When you get into the chapters about President Obama's struggle to figure out what to do about the Russians in the summer of 2016, in the middle of the election, it was the issue that kept coming up in his mind. Yes, he said to his aides who came to him with lists of things we could do to the Russians, we could cut them off from the world economy. We could reveal Vladimir Putin's billions that he's hidden around the world. We could mess up the finances of the oligarchs. But what if Putin escalates by coming back on election day and actually affecting the vote, registration systems, even just turning off the electric power in key districts? And it was the fear of that that kept the Obama administration from acting against the Russians. And anyway, since they all knew Hillary was going to win, they figured they'd do some sanctions later and turn it over to her later on. I read later that it didn't work out like that. That gives you a sense of what the problem is we have today. We have the most sophisticated cyber weapons on Earth, and we're worried about using them because we can't control that ladder of escalation. So Warren, I'm going to leave it at that and take your questions. The whole idea of subjecting myself to an interview by Warren was a little bit daunting, but he convinced me he was going to be gentle. He said there were no guarantees about all of you. Thanks very much again for having me here.
Thank you, David. We're going to... By the way, your dean, Courtney Smith, is here all by himself in the front row because people named Anne-Marie Murphy, are you here? Because there's a seat waiting for you here. Maureen Quinn, I know, is here. There's a seat for her right there. Richard Gannon, are you here? And, yes? Okay. And Miss Tinker, is Miss Tinker here? Otherwise, we've got three free seats in the front row here, and I encourage you to come forward. David, thanks a lot. Your interviewers actually are out there.
Okay.
But I will start it off with a couple of questions I have. You have a nice image in the book about how difficult it is for us to measure how dangerous this is. And you say we've been waiting for the Pearl Harbor, but there's not going to be a Pearl Harbor. There's not going to be a signal. There have been these incremental things that you've been talking about, been happening, and that we can't really stop. And then you also talk about, you think that ultimately the only way this can ever be controlled in any way at all is if there is some sort of convention, is if the countries that have the power, but of course that's so many countries when you talk about cyber weapons.
And a lot of non-countries, a lot of...
And a lot of, yeah,
right.
that's right, what we call non-state actors
That's
here
right.
at the UN. It was easy when it's 8 countries have nuclear weapons now, right?
9.
9 countries have nuclear weapons. I think President Kennedy predicted in 1960 that 20 would, and he was off by. But now the number is sort of infinite of people that have access to cyber weapons for the reasons you've said. You make a stab at the end of the book in saying, here are some recommendations of what we must do. You want to review that for me?
So first, the big question of whether or not you could have a sort of digital Geneva Convention is going to be a huge issue for the next few years. And the concept of a digital Geneva Convention is obviously based on the more traditional 1940s Geneva Convention, which really has its roots back, more than a century ago. But the Geneva Convention is intended to protect civilians. And that's a key concept here, because all of you are the collateral damage in a state-on-state cyber war that's going on 30,000 feet above your head and you can't really control. A way to think about this, and then a way to think about the solutions, is this. In your non-digital life, you do a bunch of things to go protect your house and your families. You have locks on the door, might have an alarm system, you've got a surveillance system maybe, or some surveillance cameras, you've got insurance if something goes wrong. Those are sort of the standard things we do. And the locks keep you from sort of petty crime, you hope, and the alarm system. And that's sort of what your antivirus protection does on your computer, because that only protects you against attacks that we've seen before, right? Gets updated, but if you're the first victim of a new kind of attack, the antivirus system isn't going to do you much good. It's what two-factor authentication does. You know, when you get that code back on your cell phone from the bank before they allow you to conduct a transaction. None of us did that a few years ago. So the good news, Warren, is our own cyber protections are better than they were 5 or 10 years ago. The bad news is there are so many more things connected to the internet in your home and around the world that the problem is expanding exponentially while our protections creep up, right? So
It's a bit of a catch-22. In other words, the more advanced we get, the more vulnerable we are. Yes?
That's absolutely right. And the geopolitical side of this is the most vulnerable countries in the world are the most wired in the world. And the least vulnerable countries in the world are the poorest and least wired in the world. So supposing we said when North Korea attacked Sony or when they stole $86 million from the Bangladeshi bank, they nearly got $1 billion, but they made a spelling mistake in the transfer orders that they had put through. It's just like your mother always said, proofread everything. But in each of those cases, we have seen that the basic protections may help you, but in fact, the vulnerabilities will overwhelm you. And if you think about your own house, 10 years ago, you probably had 1 or 2 things connected to the internet, maybe a desktop computer and a laptop computer. Today, you've got your Alexa, right? Which is the spy master's dream. You've got a smart TV or maybe several smart TVs. You might have a car that's connected to the internet. We got a car over the summer where I learned later on I could lock it and unlock it from anywhere in the world from my iPhone. On the one hand, that's terrific. You're not going to get locked out of your car. And on the other hand, neither is a hacker, right? Okay. You might have an internet-connected refrigerator. I've never figured out what to do with one. I guess if it told me to eat less, that might be useful. But the fact of the matter is, you've got all these devices, and if you look at the numbers, you're probably going to have twice as many by 2020. Every one of them is an additional attack surface. And that's why I say that we're not going to have a technological solution to get out of this. So while there are certain things that you can go do, in the end, we're probably going to need this kind of digital Geneva Convention. The problem is that it needs to be signed up to by more than countries, because we have criminal groups that hack, we have patriotic hackers, we have teenagers. None of them sign treaties. Mm-hmm. Or at least the teenagers who grew up in my household do not sign treaties, I discovered. So that tells you that our political challenge here is going to be far greater than it was in the nuclear age.
Do you know what I say we for the moment, the United States or the West, is doing to create bigger and better cyber weapons?
We do. We know a fair bit about it. A lot of it is wrapped in secrecy, and I'll get to that in a moment. But we know that the US government spends about $17 billion that we can find in the budget on cyber offense and defense. They are not easily divisible the way they are in more traditional weapons. But from all that we can tell, we weight that much more heavily toward the offense. Okay? Cyber Command,
which a lot of people think is a mistake, yes?
Oh, some people think it's a mistake, or a mistake if you don't know, if you're doing it without figuring out how to stop the arms race.
Yep.
Right. So, we're sort of at that point where we were in the late 1950s when we were building nuclear weapons like mad, but we didn't really have a concept of when we would and would not use them. And you remember there was a big public debate that ended up in a completely different place than it started. I mean, MacArthur wanted to use nuclear weapons against Korea. We learned a few weeks ago from documents that I ended up writing about that Michael Beschloss had found for his new book, Presidents of War, that Westmoreland wanted to use them in South Vietnam, put them in South Vietnam and use them against North Vietnam. That was an era running up to the late 60s when we still thought of this as an ordinary weapon. And then because of a big public debate, we ended up saying, no, we're only going to use nuclear weapons as a matter of national survival. And really for the past 20 years, no one has seriously thought about using nuclear weapons except if we needed to protect the survival of the nation. We've never had the equivalent debate in cyber. Why not? Well, for one thing, we have a government that has wrapped cyber in so much secrecy that nobody in the US government will talk about what our weapons are, what our capabilities are. More importantly, Warren, they won't talk about what happens when we lose our cyber weapons. And we have lost a lot lately. You all heard, of course, about Edward Snowden, and he revealed programs, but the far bigger, more important hack of the US weapon system was something called shadow brokers, which first came out about 2 years ago, we believe to be Russian in nature, which came from some insiders who actually took the cyber weapons and vulnerabilities used by the NSA, by a group within the NSA called the Tailored Access Operations Unit, since been renamed, that breaks into foreign computer systems. And you all remember the WannaCry attack that the North Koreans did against, ended up taking out part of the British healthcare system? That was all based on stolen American weapons. Did the US government own up to it? Not once. When I wrote on the front page of the Times that if we had lost a traditional missile and it had been shot back at an American ally, whoever was responsible would be court-martialed in public, right? But in this case, no one got hurt for it. Well, the general counsel of the NSA called me the next day to make the argument that the analogy was bad, that the fault here was entirely the North Koreans. They're the ones, after all, who did the attack. I don't think that actually washes with the American people if you've got a country that's building cyber weapons and can't protect them.
You know, in the election hack, which is the one we focus on because it was so important and we've been able to find out sort of what happened, and you reveal it in the book, it occurs to me that to be successful, I mean, what we all fear is that maybe one day they'll be able to actually change the numbers, get inside the election machines to count. But you don't have to do that to be successful. All you have to do
is make people think that you
this is a question, is make people think. Yeah. Make people lose faith in the institutions they believe in. That's what cyber weapons do. Even without accomplishing too much, right? They make you. They enable a president of the United States to say, how many votes was it that might have been stolen? Which is a ridiculous phrase. Except now you think, yeah, but you know, with the cyber weapons out there changing the totals, maybe that kind of thing could have happened.
So the psychological element of this is huge. We didn't destroy all of Iran's centrifuges. We only destroyed about 1,000. But we made them scared about turning on the other ones until they figured out what went on, right? We didn't destroy all of Kim Jong-un's missiles. We only sent some of them off into the sea. But we made him worry enough about what could happen that he changed systems.
You have to give up, that's right, give up the old system.
Both the Iranians and the North Koreans recovered from it. In the voting system, we are saved by the fact that our state-by-state voting system is so disparate, so backward, so crazy that no one can figure it out, including the Russians, okay? And this is our greatest protection. The most vulnerable country would be, say, the European countries that mandate we all use the same kind of electronic voting machines and we use them nationwide, right? So I don't worry that much about the voting machines themselves, although I did have pause about that this summer when I went out to Las Vegas to one of these big hacker conventions, and they had taken some state-by-state voting machines, which they had bought on eBay as the states got rid of them, and they set some 11-year-olds to the task of hacking into them. And it took them basically under an hour to go do it.
You know, the reason I'm smirking, I'm remembering something. There are a couple of people in the room who may remember the name Russell Baker. Russell Baker was a wonderful humor columnist.
Still around.
Still around, but we don't have humor columnists at the New York Times anymore. And the debate at that point, about 30 years ago, was about MIRVs, M-I-R, multiple independent reentry vehicles.
Very good.
They were missiles, and when the missile went off, then the warheads could go in 10 different directions. And the issue was, how do we protect them from the Russians? In other words, how do we make sure the Russians don't come and bomb them in the ground, left of launch? And Russell Baker said, easy. You put them on scheduled Amtrak trains, and then you give the Russians the schedule. They'll never find it.
That's right. I remember the column.
Toward the end also, you talk about there will have to be some sort of international cooperation, as you were saying before.
Yeah.
The cooperation will have to involve also non-state actors and people like that. And then you mentioned, sort of towards the end, what's a pretty pathetic sort of attempt at international cooperation. That was the one that involved Facebook, and I've got it written down here somewhere, but it didn't get very far. It was a compact that was signed.
Right.
And Google did not sign it.
That's right. So there have been several efforts to come up with some minimum standards among companies. And interestingly, this has come up mostly in the corporate world because governments haven't gone and done this. And the idea was that the companies would say, we will not knowingly participate in any kind of hacking. If we discover attacks on election systems any place in the world, we will go to try to stop that, so forth and so on. It's an interesting effort. It was spurred by people like Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, used to be their general counsel, who has really pushed this idea of a digital Geneva Convention. I like the concept, and one of the reasons I like the concept is that if you organize the convention outside of governments, in other words, you don't leave it to governments to do it, you're much more likely to get something done fairly quickly. If you have a big government-to-government negotiation, it's going to be like the GATT Accords, or any other kind of trade accord, which took years to go negotiate. But part of the problem here, Warren, is that one of the biggest obstacles to setting these minimum standards of what we won't attack, I think, will be us, will be the United States. Just play this sort of thought experiment in your mind. Okay, you're the Secretary of State, and you're taking a brief moment from pulling your hair out about the Saudis, and you're writing up a memo to all of your fellow cabinet members saying, I'm going to go out and negotiate an international cyber accord. And so we have to think about the things that we're willing to give up attacking because we want to get everybody else to agree to give up attacking those. So we had a bunch of beers down in the State Department commissary, and we came up with a list. Nursing homes, hospitals, electric grid, election systems. This memo hits the NSA, the CIA, other intelligence agencies. I'm betting, based on fairly lengthy conversations with people who've lived in that world for a long time, that they would stop and say, wait a minute, do we really want to stop all meddling with election systems? Yeah, I know what Vladimir Putin did was really bad, but if you want to take this off the table for a president of the United States, you may be denying him or her the ability to stop a war before it happens. And after all, we meddled in the Italian elections in 1948. more Latin American elections in the 50s and 60s than I can count, the Japanese elections, the South
Iran.
Korean elections. We ran a coup in Iran. Thank you, Kermit Roosevelt. So it's not as if we haven't done this before, just in a pre-digital age. Turn off electric power systems? Well, I just told you before about Nitro Zeus, right? I'm sure that the CIA and Cyber Command and NSA would say, we may well have to go unplug a country rather than go to war with them. Wouldn't you prefer we do that? So I think it's going to be a really tough haul to get the US to sign on.
Actually, the original rationale for cyber weapons was to avoid a shooting war.
That's
yes?
right. That it would be better for civilians. And so far it has, because you can't really find civilians who have died because of a cyber attack. Sooner or later, this is going to happen because somebody will turn off electric power someplace, and you can imagine what will happen.
Or they'll have a
with that.
self-driving car which would be guided by somebody in
That's
North
right.
Korea off a cliff.
That's right. And, talk about the psychological effects. The first time you read about somebody who got into their self-driving car to go to the supermarket and ended up going over that cliff, you're going to think twice about getting into your self-driving car, which is why the companies that are building this, Tesla, General Motors, others, are investing so much in the cybersecurity of the cars.
All right, I began by saying you would scare us all to death. I was scared to death in reading the book because I saw no way out of the dilemma which you so precisely lay out in the book. Am I too scared? I mean, you do have the word fear in the subtitle, as I pointed out.
Yeah, no, it's War, Sabotage, and Fear, because...
Were you able to sleep after writing that book? I was not able to sleep very well after reading it.
If I couldn't sleep because of the stuff I write about in life, which is, nuclear conflict, what we've seen in the past few days with Saudi Arabia, whatever. If I couldn't sleep for each one of those, I'd never get any sleep. So yeah, I fall asleep instantly. But the big element here is how much is too much fear. There's a new issue of Foreign Affairs out about nuclear weapons. And one of the arguments that one of the authors make, I happen to disagree with it, but it's an interesting argument, is, we haven't seen a nuclear weapon go off since 1945. And yet, every year we've had escalating warnings about what happens when one of these goes out of control. And, it's a brilliant argument to make in foreign affairs because you figure that when you're proven wrong, you're probably not around to have to go answer for it later on. But that is a big issue with cyber. I actually think the risk is greater in cyber that something will go wrong because we're using it every day, and because it's so integral to everything in our lives.
I'll ask you one last thing. I'm speculating about something. I grew up in New York City in the 50s, and the New York Times would print these pictures about what would happen if a nuclear weapon were dropped. And of course, New York City was the prime target. And I remember those pictures well. Westchester County would be sort of hatch marks. You'd come in maybe to the Bronx, it'd be kind of pixelated. But by the time you got to where I lived in the middle of Manhattan, it was just black. And what that meant was you wouldn't know it hit you. You were gone. And I remember lying in bed and hearing airplanes above and literally thinking, this could be the last second of my life, and I won't know when it happens. I mention that because there was the Beat Generation then. The Beat Generation happened for a lot of reasons, but one of them was fear of the bomb. I wonder if there is a cultural moment of that kind, I hope the answer is no, coming if people really begin to contemplate how awesome and how scary this potential is.
Well, they may. You think about the 4 different kind of vulnerabilities we have to cyber. They're sort of on a sliding scale, right? So we've got the vulnerability of espionage, but that's basically just ramping up what people used to do by reading each other's mail or tapping each other's phones. Then you've got the vulnerability of data manipulation. That one scares me much more. Espionage doesn't particularly, because that is the possibility of changing votes, but it's also the possibility that somebody gets into the military's databases and changes the blood types of every soldier and sailor. And you can imagine the long-term damage of that. or that you get in and change the targeting of a nuclear weapon or a non-nuclear weapon. And that's part of the difficulty when we do this to the North Koreans. We open ourselves up to people thinking that's fair game. Then there's the category of destroying actual things that happen, that run our lives. The utility grid, the phone system, those nuclear centrifuges. The final one, the most subtle one, is the information warfare side that we've been so obsessed with for the past 2 years. And that one is hard in particular because we're an open society. We want to have a lot of communication. If anybody here took out one of these ads themselves calling for secession in Texas, or calling for attacking the Black Lives Matter movement or some similar political movement, it would be within your First Amendment rights as an individual, but we want to ban it when foreign countries do it. And that means you've got to really know who the author was. And that's the core of Facebook's dilemma, right? So that is the kind of very subtle use that I worry about the most, that and data manipulation, much more so than the big attack that takes out all the power from Boston to Washington.
You mentioned in your introductory remarks, and I forget the exact reference, but you were talking about how dangerous it would be to let journalists run the world. I forget what example you had. And I
think it was letting journalists be hit teams. Yeah, right.
And I was in London, as you know, for 8 years for the New York Times.
And we dined very well when you were, as I recall.
Well, thank you. Two of my very good friends were Michael Gove of the Times of London and Boris Johnson, who was to become the architect of Brexit. So it was two journalists who basically designed Brexit, and that's the problem that Britain faces right now, and it's all our fault.
That's it.
Anyway, David, I'm going to open this up to the floor. Wonderful. What I'm going to do, David, is take 3 questions at once. When I cite you, I'll go 1, 2, and 3, and when the microphone comes to you, if you can stand up, that's great, because we can hear you more easily. Please identify yourself. It's all being filmed back there, so I want the people far away from it to know who's asking the question. So number 1 in the corner.
Thank you very much for having this. I'm enthralled by what you're talking about, and thank you for risking what you're risking in order to do this research. I have 3 points. I recently went to the...
Didn't identify. I know who you are.
My name is Joanna Mayer. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the meetings that you have. I recently went to the Fordham Law School to the Center on National Security for a talk by former CIA Director John Brennan and Congressman Jerry Nadler, and they expressed great concern over the election system in the United States. We all thought in the room that the conversation would be centered around foreign policy, but it was almost entirely on our election system. And so I disagree with you that we are not at risk. I think we're at great risk, and you brought up this point about the 11-year-old hacking into the system. I think that we're not very secure. Second point, I attend many meetings at the UN where the question of intellectual property comes up, and I support the idea of a convention on cybersecurity, but I find it hard to believe that the US, China, and Russia would sign any such thing. And lastly, you mentioned that the countries that are more using cyber, like Estonia, they say it's E for Estonia. This country has put a lot of their systems on the computer. I doubt that Estonia would be hacked. I think if Estonia were hacked, it would be to less detriment than if another country were to be hacked. So anyway, thank you.
Hang on to that. The second, this gentleman there.
Well, thank you so much. My name is Amit Oj. I work with the New Delhi Television Limited. It's a broadcast network in India. And I'm here with the UN for a fellowship, or a UN journalism fellowship. My question is with regards to elections also. It's with regards to the Indian election, which are coming up in just a few months. And the debate in India about whether our dynamic and evolving election system as the world's largest democracy can actually handle an electronic voting system as a viable, foolproof method of elections. So far, what's happened is that at least in one political party has raked up the issue of the elections literally being rigged, and many talking about how some members of the major political party that is out there, the BJP, actually having some codes that allow them to rig elections. Now, this is obviously a conspiracy theory. Nobody's proved it. Do you see it as a realistic possibility that the world's largest democracy could be going ahead into its election knowing the result already?
And the third person, yes, here in the front. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Ayaka Suzuki. I work in the Secretary General's office, and as you know, this is an issue of great interest and concern for the Secretary General. And I'm a great admirer of your work over the last decade, so great to see you. So first point is that, as you mentioned, cyber conflicts are difficult not only because of difficulty of attribution, but there are no clear rules of the game, right? So we don't even know when things are actually escalated, but beyond that, there are also unintended consequences. When there was a cyber attack on Ukraine, it actually shut down the shipping operations of one of the largest shipping company. So we just don't know, right? So that makes it even more difficult to engage on a policy response. But what I really wanted to pick your brain on is, as you mentioned, you alluded to the idea of digital convention, Geneva Convention, that's been floated around for quite some time. You know that at the first committee of the General Assembly, the group of government experts have failed to even agree to the idea that international humanitarian law applies to cyberspace. So given that, and then the fact of the matter is that we have 20th century institutions dealing with 21st century problems, what could be the possibility of finding solutions to cooperation in this area? Because as you also mentioned, it's not just state actors engaging in these attacks. So it also makes it even more difficult to come up with a set of protocols that apply to not just state actors, but as well as, well, terrorists don't care about that for that matter. And barriers to entry are much, much lower today. Thank you.
You actually quote a diplomat in the book by saying we're trying to solve 21st century problems with 19th century solutions.
That's right. In fact, it was in response to President Obama's actions against the Russians. And I think his quote was that we just found the perfect 19th century solution to a 21st century problem. And this was one of his aides. This was somebody who actually, liked what he was doing. So
Take those three questions, then we'll get three more.
Three great questions. So Ms. Maier, to you first. So on the election system, I'm less worried about the machines, with an exception that I will just describe. And I've had this same conversation with the people who you heard from this, John Brennan and others. I'm less worried about the machines than I am with everything that we surround it with. So the solution to the machine seems to be fairly basic to me. We should not allow voting machines of any kind to be used in the United States that do not have a paper backup. Yeah. Okay? There are 14 states that have at least partial no paper backup. There are 5 states that have none whatsoever. Yeah. Okay? And that seems to me to be inexcusable, because you can go off and do an electronic election as long as you've got something, even if it takes you weeks to sort it out, you've got a way to go sort it out. And I think that's pretty critical. I worry less about the machines on election day than the day before the election, when somebody programs those machines with the ballot. And while everybody will tell you that the election machines are not online, and they are not, the programming that ultimately goes into those machines is online. The other thing that's online is the registration system, right? Because that's got to be outwardly facing. And that's what the Russians were probing in 2016. They weren't going after the machines, they were going after the registration system. So that if Warren showed up at his precinct and they said, gee, this is very nice, Mr. Hoge, but we understand that you have moved back to London. And you say, well, no, actually, I'm still right here. Eventually, it would get sorted out, but the fact of the matter is, it would make a lot of people wonder if their vote got counted. The intellectual property side of this is something President Obama pushed when he did the agreement with China that came after the OPM attack, and it was an agreement not to steal intellectual property. The reason they did it was this was easy common ground. We have normal intellectual property laws in the non-digital world. So transferring those over to digital seemed to be pretty simple. The problem is it didn't address the problem that we were facing, all of the rest of this kind of digital activity. Estonia, that it couldn't be hacked or would be less likely to be hacked, it was hacked by the Russians in 2007. In fact, that was one of the original sins of cyber conflict. Ahmed's question on elections in India. We thought 10 or 15 years ago that the internet was a blessing to democracy around the world. I was White House correspondent at the end of Bill Clinton's time in office, and we would go to Beijing, and he would go to Beida, Beijing University, and he'd give these great speeches where, while he phrased it politely, basically said, the internet will be the end of the Communist Party in China, because as a rising middle class comes up, demands more freedom, gets more information, the party will crack apart. The height of this analysis was the Arab Spring, when we saw kids going out into Tahrir Square, organizing protests over Twitter and Facebook messages, and we thought, wow, what a democratizing capability. And now for the past 5 or 6 years, we've seen the backlash, because Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and everybody else, every other authoritarian on earth has said, we know how to go use this as well as an instrument of surveillance, as a way of tracking down dissidents. I mean, Facebook is an authoritarian's dream, because the first thing they want to do when they arrest somebody is figure out who are their friends. Okay?
That's the word they use. That's right. Friends.
That's it. So yeah, there are big risks to this, and I hope that as India moves into this, they go and study pretty hard every mistake that we and others have made. Suzuki-san, to your question about Ukraine and what we saw happen there. It's a really fascinating example. The chapter on Ukraine in the book is called Putin's Petri dish. It's called that because every single thing that Vladimir Putin did in the United States in 2016 and beyond, he first attempted in Ukraine. Were we awake to it? Part of it. We sent a team in to go figure out how the Russians turned off the power at 2 big power plants. We didn't look at what they did in the election. What they did was everything they ultimately ended up doing here. In the end, while I think we need international agreements, and I fully support doing those, and we know that the UN Council of Experts, or group of experts on this, was doing good work and then sort of ran off the cliff as soon as the Russians and the Chinese and the US couldn't come to an agreement. But we also need deterrence, right? We need both. And we haven't figured out the deterrent part of this. I keep on my desk, and did during the time I was writing this book, a book that Henry Kissinger wrote in 1957 called Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. And it was an effort by Kissinger to sort of lay out for a public audience how you would deter the use of nuclear weapons. Now, he came up with some suggestions that today he might not sign on to, including the possibility of using limited nuclear war. In fact, we know he hasn't signed on to those things. But it was a laudable first effort. And we now have the beginnings of efforts at Stanford, at Harvard, at MIT, at the University of Chicago, down in Texas, of different cyber centers trying to figure out the deterrence problem. But we haven't gotten there yet, because we haven't quite figured out what do you do with the attack that looks like it came from a state, but maybe didn't.
Excellent. We'll get 3 more questions. I've got one here and one there, and I'll take this young man in the front row. Start with Mr. Laurenti.
Thank you.
And please identify yourself.
Yes, Jeff Laurenti. David, in negotiating the arms control agreements, there's long been tension within the U.S. government over whether our interests are better served by just having bigger and better weapons of our own, rather than getting caught in a web of multilateral agreements. And we know that particularly the current regime is very suspicious of them, at least in terms of regular arms. What is your sense of the sense of concern within the U.S. government about the urgency of dealing with the cyber weapons threat? Because to the extent that the targets are nursing homes or people's lives, those are inconveniences that the high priesthood of national security types might be willing to suffer in order to safeguard the crown jewels? Or is there sufficient concern that the military assets, that those who help shape U.S. international policy are most concerned with are themselves manipulable and that they can't guard against it? In other words, do they have a sense that it is urgent, or is this something that for those who drive national security policy, it would be nice to be able to avoid it, but it's relatively limited in terms of scope of what we, national security priesthood, cares about?
Craig Whitney here in the second row.
Craig Whitney, I'm absolutely horrified by almost everything I've heard here tonight. I live in a house that only has 2 of the devices that you mentioned, David. But my question is just a kind of nuts and bolts one. There was talk about turning off Iran by presumably shutting down its, power system. Mm-hmm. Could North Korea shut down the United States, or if not the whole United States, enough of it to paralyze everything? Could North Korea, if it did that, see that as a deterrent to us doing something else that we then wouldn't do?
And then finally, and be careful, this young man is covering this event for the Seton Hall newspaper. Felipe Bueno.
Hello, David. My name is Felipe. Thank you so much for being here. Last week, Foreign Policy published an article on Israeli cybersecurity firms, and they likened it to mercenaries for hire. For the digital Geneva Conventions that you had mentioned, which I think is a fascinating idea, how would you incentivize corporations to get on board? You had mentioned Facebook and Google, and as we saw recently, getting Google to just show up at the Senate was like pulling teeth. So I kind of want to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Great. Another 3 great questions. So to Mr. Laurenti's first, the urgency of dealing with the cyber threat here varies tremendously. There's a moment in the book that comes from when Maggie Haberman and I did the lengthy foreign policy interviews with then candidate Trump, and I raised cyber issues a few times. It didn't work out well. He said the cyber was very powerful, and he talked around it a fair bit. But I don't think he is somebody who has yet sort of fully absorbed this, even though his own hotel empire was under huge amounts of regular cyber attack. There are a lot of people who believe that we won't get our act together until there's a truly massive attack on the US, that's Cyber Pearl Harbor. And I went and interviewed Leon Panetta, who used the word Cyber Pearl Harbor in several speeches when he was defense secretary. And he conceded to me that he used it primarily to try to wake up Congress. He didn't think it was the biggest cyber threat, but he thought it was the one they would understand. And part of the difficulty we're suffering from here is this stuff seems technological and complex, and somehow it's still acceptable in the political world to say, oh, I don't understand all this cyber stuff if you're a senator or a congressman, but I asked my 13-year-old daughter to explain it to me. And I sort of want to grab these people and say, back in the nuclear age, would it have been acceptable politically to say, oh, this nuclear stuff, it's nuclear physics? I asked my 13-year-old son or daughter to go explain it to me, right? And the fact of the matter is, That would have made somebody feel foolish if they said that about nuclear weapons. And yet it's acceptable in the cyber world because it makes you sort of a regular person to say, oh, this stuff's so complicated, I can barely use my computer.
But the nukes could annihilate 100,000 people in an instant.
That's the difference.
Public fear.
So that was the public fear. We don't know how powerful a cyber weapon can be. In the cyber world, we're roughly where we were at the end of World War I with airplanes, okay? We knew they could drop bombs because we saw this happen in World War I. The atom bomb had not yet been invented. So we knew the delivery vehicle and we didn't know the weapon. It was 37 years between the time that the Wright brothers first showed the military flyer to a bunch of generals in College Park, Maryland, and the time that we dropped the bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Only 37 years. And nobody could have imagined at the Wright brothers moment that you could actually send an airplane across an ocean and drop a weapon of that power. So we have to enter this with a fair bit of humility that we really have no idea what the warhead will look like. We only know what the delivery vehicle looks like. On the question of could somebody else shut down the United States, you may remember that back in the spring, the Department of Homeland Security turned out a warning about Russian-made malware that was throughout the American electric grid. These are called implants, and countries put implants in a system to either monitor it or be able to attack it later on. That would be something where you'd think early on, this is something we should ban in that Digital Geneva Convention. Except, wait a minute, we've put hundreds of thousands of implants in foreign computer systems around the world.
As in the Stuxnet virus, for instance.
Including Stuxnet, but also in Russian systems and North Korean systems and Iranian systems and the systems of some of our allies, right? And we say to them, oh, don't worry about it. We don't have any, we're the United States, we don't have any evil intent. The problem when you look at malware is you can't figure out the intent of the person who put it in. So we freak out when we see the Russian malware in our systems, but we expect everybody else to think of our malware as benign. This isn't going to work. The final question on Israeli cybersecurity firms. So Israel's built up a very big cybersecurity economy because they grab kids early, figure out their math and programming skills, put them in Unit 8200, which is their equivalent of the NSA. They spend a few years of their military service in there. They do great work, including the Stuxnet virus, which they worked on with the United States. They then leave 8200 when they leave their military service, and they start these cybersecurity firms that are all around Unit 8200. You go to Unit 8200, which you can't miss because it's the only thing out that's next to the Mossad building, and it's got, antennas all over the place. And then around it are all these startup companies. Just as around Fort Meade in Maryland, we've got lots of cybersecurity firms. The ones that got in trouble that you were reading about were ones that were selling basically surveillance weapons to authoritarian governments and saying, we have no idea how this is being used. We've sold them a capability and told them to use it legally. It's sort of the gun manufacturer's argument. We sell the guns, we don't tell people how to use them, we expect them to use them within the law. And you're going to need a lot more transparency about who did what to whom before this all sorts its way through.
If there are no more, okay, we'll take a couple of more questions, but I want to give David a lot of time to talk to you all and to sign some books. So I saw a gentleman in the back, first one I saw, well, there are more than I can handle, I think. Gentleman there, and we'll do four. There are two women here, okay?
Thank you, sir. I'm Joshua Ayers. I'm an alumni of Seton Hall University. I wanted to address something that I thought you said was particularly interesting, and you had identified cyber as the new strategic diplomatic weapon of choice in giving world leaders a different options other than pursuing direct military conflict. You also mentioned that cyber is the initiation for any sort of military conflict, or starts there. Traditionally, that's been with psychological warfare. Which do you think is more important for cyber? Attacking the systems or attacking people's thoughts and beliefs, or particular in behavior modification? I wanted to know which one you think poses a greater threat to security.
The second, yeah, this gentleman here, exactly.
I'm Albert Golston, Cerulean Council. We review geopolitical risk. There's another factor involved as well, an outlier possibility. I don't know if that's been brought up officially or unofficially. The entry into cyber warfare is rather low. Is it possible that you could have the development of, it's right out of a James Bond movie, a cyber specter, in which you have a whole bunch of very smart guys, smart women, who are either criminals or anarchists or both, who really don't have a specific political agenda, but basically their purpose is really to cause havoc or even provoke any sort of cyber war or any other incident between sovereign governments?
And the two women, one here and one there. Michael, I think, either way, this woman first, good, and then.
Hi, how are you? My name is Amanda Yang. I'm a student of Seton Hall University. I just want to thank you for being with us today. You mentioned earlier that because of broadband and because of the things that students download, such as
Hold the
Netflix.
microphone a little closer to the mouth.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Such as because of broadband and the things that students download, such as Netflix and I guess audio files and music, that we're kind of more vulnerable to being a target as to the last spot that cyber attackers may pinpoint, I should say. So that's the last spot they see. So what can universities do as a whole, and for students, do to kind of protect ourselves, and for safety reasons, I would say make us less vulnerable to that sense.
And finally, this young woman here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Roxanne Hadish. I'm also from Seton Hall University. You've been explaining us a lot of examples in which there have been cyber attacks between countries. How about, do you have any story or example about like cyber technology being used to enhance the security of a nation? And if so, in the case of an attack between two countries, would a third country be able to provide some kind of protection if one of the two is like not so developed in terms of cyber technology?
Excellent. Answer those quickly, and then we'll start signing some books.
So, Josh, you asked about the question of whether psychological warfare or whether or not an actual attack on infrastructure is the greatest fear. The nature of cyber attacks is if you're an attacker, you don't have to choose.
That's right.
You get to use them both. You can start with the what you call psychological warfare, what Stalin called information warfare. You know, in the American view of cyber, we always separated out the sort of physical attack stuff from the information warfare stuff. If you talk to Russians about this, they always looked at that and said, that's crazy. This is all part of the same. And you start with one and you move on to the other. And that's, of course, exactly what we've seen Putin do. Albert, you talked about the entry cost of cyber being very low. It is. If you want nuclear weapons, you need uranium, plutonium, millions of dollars, infrastructure, reprocessing plants. It's a big, big problem, right? If you're doing cyber weapons, you need some people the age of the students out here. You need some laptops. You need a little stolen data from the NSA. Fortunately, there's plenty of that that's downloadable. A case of Red Bull, that would be good, okay? And you're kind of good to go. And that does make this particularly difficult. Could a group like that create havoc and try to set country against country? Seems to me that's called the Internet Research Agency. They did a pretty good job of it. Is it Mini? Is that like your name? You asked about what universities can do and students can do and all that. So universities have become increasingly aware of the fact that they are vulnerable in two very different ways. One is that their faculties can be attacked for expertise and so forth. I teach up at the Kennedy School. You know, the Russians and the Chinese love going after places like the Kennedy School or the Council on Foreign Relations or whatever, because they think they're going to get inside the accounts of people who periodically consult with the US government or debating doctrine or whatever. They're probably pretty bored with, they get all the position papers, but you know, they make their way through it. At the same time, yeah, there are things universities can do to be safer. And you know, I'm sure that all of you go through a lot of training about what not to click on, and don't just pick up a USB and put it in your machine, and two-factor authentication and all that. And we need a lot more of this, but you know, this is basically the digital safe sex conversation that happens, you know, on every campus, right? And it's all about sort of best practices kind of thing. That will help some, but it's not going to protect you against a dedicated state actor that's coming into the universities. Finally, on the question about whether or not there are cases where cyber has been used to protect a country, all the time. I mean, you know, the Pentagon is cyber attacked, you know, millions of times a day. Most of it at such a low and not terribly scary level that you can fight it off fairly quickly. That's not, to my mind, the most interesting nature of the problem. The problem isn't the cyber attacks you see, it's the ones you're not anticipating. And when I did the work on this book, what struck me was that in the cases that I sort of recited in here, Sony, OPM, the attacks on the State Department, the White House, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff by the Russians that preceded the attack on the Democratic National Committee, and to which we made the Russians pay no price at all, speaking of a failure of deterrence, they all had something in common, which is that we had a perfect intelligence record on them, which is to say we missed every single one of them, okay? So it's not the day-to-day attacks that you fight off, it's the ones where you have never yet even designed the radar for them. And that's a particular problem in democracies because, frankly, none of us want the government rolling around inside our computer systems, right? And that's what the privacy versus security debate is all about. That's the reason I'm a very strong believer in using encryption as much as you can. Using apps like Signal, which we think has been very difficult for governments and criminals to get into. Using all kinds of other end-to-end encryption. I recognize that the FBI hates this because they think it means they're going dark. And when they subpoena the material from Apple, Apple can only hand them gobbledygook that even Apple itself cannot sort out because they don't have the key to get into all of this. But the fact of the matter is, if we're all going to have confidence in the security of our own data, we're going to have control over the ability to keep it fully encrypted.
David, the only reassuring thing, and it is reassuring, is that you who know all the details of this threat have kept your sense of humor.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been great to have you. I'm going to keep him here to sign books. I will get him a glass of wine, but please come up and chat with David.